Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Urban Fae The Geas, Part 2 by Michael Lockhart. When I awakened, I was comfortable and felt not a care in the world. I was unsure in which world I rested so contently, but I felt good physically, though some troubled thoughts gnawed at the edges of my mind. Sorsha, where was she? I raised up from my bed and immediately slammed my head into the low ceiling above, even as I cried out for her. I lay back, now with a new soreness in my forehead, and heard voices. It seems our guest is awake, and none too soon, my lord. It was a deep voice, from a small form, one of the gnome folk. Thank you, Scarde. If you don't mind, I'd like to speak with him immediately. That basso profundo was familiar. The big man. Apparently he was some big shot in the other world, with that milord title. I suspected he was after I'd trained at his little fort. Besides, he had a certain bearing. A third voice intruded. Frida. You may, but you must let him rest for at least the remainder of today. The venom and poison are gone, but he needs time to regain his strength. I could hear some slight amusement, though no mockery in the big man's tone. I shall be brief, medic. We all need him to recover fully. Presently, the door to my half-sized chamber opened. Enough light now reached me that I could see that I had not bumped my head on the ceiling, but just the top of an enclosed bed. Chamber, I suppose. A bed in a box, and I was jacked, in the language of my captors, saviors. I guess that I'd soon know for sure. I wasn't truly confident in the positive intentions of the big man, nor any other denizens of the other world. The light was briefly occluded when a large, stooped figure entered the room. The big man quickly took a seat on a bench that would have accommodated 2 or 3 of the gnome folk. So, Coyote, you didn't rest long. However, you have made an excellent warrior, and I understand that you have been designated a gnome friend. Impressive. Now we will get you well and back on your feet, so that you can assume your quest to find your lost love. Very romantic. Ah, there's the slightly mocking tone, I assured myself. I was feeling a little grumpy. I had no intentions of abiding by the medic's advice. I glared. I don't suppose anyone else has taken up the hunt for her while I was out for I don't know how long. He sat silently for a moment. He clearly disliked my tone and implications. You have been out for a day and a night, and you will rest and eat until tomorrow morning. Then we will pick up the search wherever it has led my minions to this point. I hung my head. I apologize for my tone. I feel out of sorts, but no reason to get a bad attitude with you, sir. He nodded. Good enough. My trackers and hounds have searched the area around the dance. Sorsha was taken to the shore of the lake, where the trail would disappear for most. But I was able to enlist the aid of lake dwellers who can track through water. The trail ended at a portal. She was taken to one of the dark realms of the other world. Don't worry, you are already in Otherworld, and we are near enough to that dark realm. When you recover, I'll expect to see you ready for our mission. He reached inside his voluminous cloak and pulled out my case. You'll be needing the items within. You really must do a better job of keeping up with your toys." I was restless and seethed, but I forced myself to take it easy and eat the fine fare offered by Frida and her husband, Skarda. Apparently the gnome folk like to eat hearty dishes. She supplied a stew of chunky meat and vegetables. After the first bite, I looked up in amazement. "Dr. Frida, these are the best-tasting vegetables I've ever eaten. I've never imagined such rich taste from them. I always ate them because they were nutritious. I never thought I'd enjoy. No, adore them." Frida's habitual smile widened even further. "Why, thank you, Wolfling. Oh, and don't worry about eating on this side. Since you're Fae, that rule only applies when certain spells have been cast on the repast." I swallowed the bite I'd been chewing, along with the lump that had sprung in my throat. Once again, I'd forgotten the rules of Otherworld. The consequences could be immediate, unlike in Mundania. Now I had here even more binding laws pressing upon me. Mundane military service was looking like less of a burden. I assumed that Wolfling was the name they used for coyote. I liked it. Made it sound like I was somewhere in the same league with the Mac Tirmor, or at least playing the same sport. It sounded more dignified, I suppose, though I knew that among First Nation peoples, Coyote was the trickster god, and I felt that role applied to me as well. However, I'd become more and more forthright and less felonious in the past half year. Perhaps I was evolving from one sobriquet to another. Besides, that Coyote would likely be a major player here in Otherworld. He might not like me borrowing his name. I enjoyed visiting with Frida and Skarda that day and learned about the gnomish realm, at least that of the Lichtgnomen. They spoke only a little of the Darkgnomen, the language of their dichotomous kin. Otherworld seemed to have many diametrically opposed realms and folks to inhabit them. They were horrified that I offered to compensate them for their hospitality. Apparently, it was an honor for them to host a gnome friend. It seems that the Roar was a gnome lord or something, and the fact that he designated me and marked me made it a great prestige. Funny, a gnomish prince leading a band through his voice was much deeper than the singing prince in Mundania, and his band played instruments rather than computer-generated keyboardish stuff. The next morning, I opened my case and found not only my usual store of items, but a set of clothes. I recalled that on my last visit, the big man had mentioned placing some clothes in the case. There were some loose-fitting, predominantly dark green plaid trousers, and a kilt. I selected the trousers. I soon found a pair of windings, and Skarda supplied that they were for wrapping the lower legs to keep the legs of the breeches from flopping about. There were a couple of tunics, and I selected a dark blue one with nice embroidery around the keyhole neck and the close-fitting cuffs on the sleeves. It seemed that since the fire had removed the outer covering from my case, the interior of it had expanded considerably. I found that a deer-hide bag from inside the case hung comfortably around my shoulder, and in turn held the case with all my goods, though it felt like it held only a small amount. I donned all of my Otherworld gear. The bowler didn't fit well in the current environment, and Frida assured me that the diadem was unisex. So once I was fully dressed and adorned, I stooped and stepped out from the home of my hostess and host into the early morning sunrise in Otherworld. Mac Tirmor literally rolled up on a chariot of all things, drawn by the most perfect horses I could imagine. A short, stocky man in trousers and tunic drove the chariot. For the first time I saw my new best friend without the cloak and hood. He was resplendent in a kilt that matched the one in my case. His dark green tunic was tucked inside, and he wore both a heavy golden torque and a silver diadem that held back his flowing hair. several shades lighter than my own, except for that and the mustachio that was long and braided at each side of his mouth. He looked like a slightly older version of me. I must have projected the confusion I felt. He offered a fearsome grin that showed his bright, largest teeth. "Good morning, Wolfling. I hope you are ready to take a ride with Grandpa." I finally understood. He'd taken my side, however begrudgingly, due to family obligations. Yet where had he been all those years I was stranded in Mundania with the various Fosters? I could have been here, learning about my true heritage, learning how to deal with the other world. He used his mind-reading trick to decipher my rushing thoughts that verged on outrage. "You will learn the whys and wherefores soon enough. For now, trust that there was a purpose greater than your individual feelings at work. In the meantime, I brought you a pony to assuage your hurt feelings." He swept his massive arm with an open hand towards a sturdily built horse that followed along behind the chariot. No ropes or halters bound it, and it wore only a blanket in a tartan that matched my trousers, across the withers by way of the saddle. The coat was midnight black, and the neck arched magnificently. The mane was long and silky, and there were tufts of hair around the fetlocks. The horse raised its chin and flicked it towards me in greeting, the way Limongello used to greet me. I was soon astride the steed and trotting along beside my grandpa, the Mactir Moor, on his chariot. He introduced his driver as Girwer. It sounded like a growl, fitting for the servant of a Wolf clan lord. He tutored me on what to expect in the dark realm we approached. One of many, he assured me. "Your lady will be held near water, since that's how she was taken. Not sure what being or beings took her from the Hutao. It was a real trick, though. They led our trackers on a merry chase, and it ended by looping back to the lake. The Hutao would have carried her through the trees, from limb to limb, truly a green and growing highway for their ilk. Of course, the party that put them up to it may have moved her again by now, or ransomed her to a different being." He glanced at my blanched features. "I don't mean to distress you, Wolfling. I simply wish to convey what all difficulties may be involved in finding her." I kept my peace and worried internally, all the while attempting to hide my distress from my grandfather. Grandfather! All this time! I couldn't help but fume a little. I hoped that I hid it as well as I thought I did. For all the resentment I felt towards this man, I was impressed by him, and desperately wished to impress him in turn. "Grandfather, I've never ridden a horse before today. I thought it would be harder. I've always seen riders use reins and stirrups, but this horse seems to know where to go." The big man looked over at me. Although the chariot platform was low to the ground, he stood rather than sat, and was tall in the bargain, so we were mostly on level, despite the height of my mount. "He does. Remember where you are, Rob. Horses here are intelligent creatures, even this one who likes to loaf in Mundania and watch television, then emulate the gestures of mortals. He's an odd one, but he's stronger and faster than any other I could find. A noble mount, despite his odd predilections." My noble mount whickered in a horsey laughter, followed by a snort. He trotted a few steps with his feet raised higher than usual, a parade trot. We traveled for an indeterminate time, and it seemed that rather suddenly the sun was low in the sky and evening rapidly approached. We neared a settlement, a log fort on a hill, with several moats and terraced fortifications. Dun Amras, my grandfather rumbled. It overlooks and guards this passage and crossroads. I looked at him. From beings from the Dark Realm? He shook his head. Not exactly. It guards the way in either direction, as well as guarding a portal. We will stop here for the night and ensure that our crossing is known to the Crossroad Guardian. We must be cautious. The Crossroad Guardian is easily offended. Show him courtesy and he will treat us well enough. The food and drink will be safe to consume. At least I believe it will, and I have ways to check. So, follow my lead. The road that led to the fort was winding, and the gates at each level were offset, so that one had to pass, follow the narrow way to the next gate, then climb towards it. Eventually, we reached the apex gate, and as he had at each of the others, Mac Tirmor announced himself. He never introduced me. I rode in silence behind him and kept my mouth shut while my other senses searched for danger. I'd begun to notice smells and sounds, more than I once had. Wolfling indeed, I thought. The place did not feel hostile, nor did the regular guardians appear to be unfriendly. They were all business. They wore light armor and carried long spears. They seemed to be normal enough-looking men and women. At least they weren't creepy like so many beings in Otherworld. I soon found out that none of them was the Crossroads Guardian. We entered the hall of Dun Amras, and were shortly ushered into the presence of his nibs. Girer had stayed behind to ensure that the horses were properly attended, so it was just Grandpa and me. I was still getting used to having a grandfather. I realized that he had to be paternal, since I'd seen my maternal one at my parents' funeral, and while he'd been tall, he was not the ridiculous mass of muscles beside whom I approached the dais in the center of the circular hall. Dad had been pretty much large and muscular too, now that I thought of it. He had slightly darker hair, but now that I looked, there was a definite resemblance. I briefly hoped that I would reach similar proportions as I matured. Not an ounce of fat on this dude. He was like chiseled marble. I was looking ahead and wondered where the Crossroads Guardian might be. The only occupant of the dais was an enormous hound, like something from The Hunt. It lay across the front of the dais, tongue lolling and drool dripping like any pooch. The big bad wolf halted before the hound on the dais. Greetings, Crossroads Guardian of Dun Amras. We humbly ask for guest rights, and for passage into the next realm. The hound stared for a moment, then licked its vast chops. A voice sounded, much the way it had emanated from Tom Tildrum. Granted, Mac Tirmor. You and your cub may sup with us tonight, rest in our hostelry, and breakfast in the morning. Your beasts shall be stabled and receive care. You may enter the next realm so long as you intend no action that will lead to outright war. The Mac Tirmor inclined his head. I can promise that we will do nothing more than retrieve a member of our family. Any precipitous actions have already been taken by other parties. But we intend only to take what is ours, and have brought no armies. The hound seemed satisfied. You know the price of this hostelry. You may attend the evening meal in the guest hall once you are refreshed, or eat at the hostelry. If you choose the hall, be ready to provide news and entertainment. We left the presence, and I stalked along beside my newfound closest relative, I didn't like that. Dog. It seemed arrogant to me. Then, as I considered, I realized that it was simply a canid mind at work. Very practical and direct in thought and communication. No pleasantries, not unlike a certain coyote. Once upon a time in another world, Grandfather pointed out the guest hall with the hostelries beside it that contained sleeping quarters, and we headed in that direction. We'll go claim our space in the hostelry. We may venture to the guest hall, but we are looking to find information rather than supply it. So it may be best to simply remain in our quarters. I nodded and turned my steps towards the hostelry. Before he could stop me, I'd banged my head thoughtlessly and ignored my geish. I'd never thought of a no-tell motel as a residence. The big bad wolf assumed a stern grimace, and I realized that I had foobarred the situation. The law of hospitality is forfeit, he rumbled quietly. Our sojourn here will be fraught with more peril, thanks to your heedlessness. I couldn't even argue. I simply nodded and apologized. Since I was at fault, I volunteered to take the first and the final watches. Had it not been for me, we could have slept in peace. Grandfather would likely have set me on those watches anyway, so I might as well present myself as contrite. Besides, I knew I'd struggled to sleep since I was an open target and very preoccupied with worry for Sorsha. The guest hall would have to wait for another visit, just as well. Everyone else could use the rest. There were several other parties in the dormitory-style building, each separated by a pair of wicker screens, and all set around a central fire pit. There were no doors, just woven hangings that covered the entrance to each section. Yet the interior of our stall was quiet, and I could hear no sounds from other sections when the curtains were closed. The interior walls could be shifted to accommodate larger and smaller groups of visitors. I wasn't sure if they shifted on their own or some unseen hand moved them, but ours seemed fit to accommodate the three of us. I opened our curtains since we had decided to eat in the hostelry, and the food was placed at the center hearth. Imagine my surprise, chagrin, and fury when I saw that the curtain for the space across from ours was already opened, and there perched Siobhan on a pile of pillows, while Kotka stood at the curtain, bowls in hand, prepared to retrieve food from the common pot. He stood there in his natural felinoid form, in a vest hung with pouches, a belt, and festoon with almost as much jewelry as he had worn when he'd posted in the Glamour. "What the foobar is this?" I inquired of my companions. Grandpa looked over at the two outlaws and grinned ferociously at them, all of his teeth showing and a snarl threatening to overwhelm any fallacious charms of which the grin might hint. "As I told you, folk from any realm or province may stay at the hostelry. However, it is allowed that we may apprehend criminals when we are in hot pursuit." Siobhan remained inclined on her pillows and purred, outwardly calm. "What criminals could you possibly mean? Woof, woof." She had clearly intended to insult my grandfather, and maybe it made him angrier, but it was hard to tell since he had already been pretty outraged, and his features were flushed scarlet. Kotka looked nonplussed, unsure of whether to fill the bowls or scat in terror. I loosened my blades and mentally encouraged him to flee, or better yet, attack, so that I could kill him without worry over laws of hospitality. Unfortunately, he decided to stand still rather than to tempt fate or Fae. The Maktir Moor issued a growl from deep in his chest. "You kidnapped or facilitated the taking of your sister against her will. You took her from a celebration, and your minions are set upon the good folk at the dance." He never took a step, yet somehow he appeared to approach that arrogant being when he loomed. She tried to cover her reaction, but tiny beads of sweat broke out upon her upper lip. "Gotcha," I shouted in internal triumph. I had to give her credit for sheer nerve, though. She shrugged. "Why would I have to kidnap my own sister? If I invited her, she would come with me anywhere. Am I not her loving sibling? Not to mention the oath that she and her pet scavenger elicited. My companion and I left the dance after we completed our passages. We were not there for any attack, did you say?" she purred, more cat-like than her familiar, who now looked nervously back and forth between his mistress and the Mac Timor. Apparently, I wasn't much of a threat. I had to agree. Between all the possibilities, I was probably the least dangerous option. Nor was Grandpa Wolf fooled. He probably smelled her fear. Did I? Her scent had changed. When did I catch her scent? Maybe there were nuances in my nature that had not yet come to full light. The rumbling growl from the chest of the big man repeated, "I cannot prove it for no. And we pursued those that laid hands on her until we lost the trail. But we shall be watching you, Sly One. You overreach, despite whom your father was. You are not so beloved that you can avoid my wrath should I decide to destroy you. I smell your fear, and it shows that you have good sense in that regard at least. We wish to find your sister and make her safe. I am inclined to get information from you the fun way, but will not break law." He glanced at Gerer, who stepped forward with bowls for himself and his master. I followed his example and filled my own ahead of Kotka, though he had been standing at the pot before us. It was a breach of courtesy, but not of law. Frankly, it was petty and spiteful, but I think we all wanted to precipitate a violent physical reaction that would allow us to respond rather than initiate the breach of the peace. Yet Kotka waited patiently, and after he'd filled the bowls, he darted into the flimsy chamber with his mistress and abruptly closed the hanging. The tension in my shoulders relaxed, though I hadn't realized it had built. We adjourned to our space and ate in silence. I mentally prepared for my watch and hoped that Siobhan didn't know about my geisha. She might break the laws of hospitality anyway, but she seemed frightened, a little unsure of herself, like she was swimming in waters that were deeper than she realized, until she could no longer sense the bottom. I chuckled. Fire spirits should not swim at all, regardless of the depth. My grandfather and his charioteer looked up at me, then at one another and smiled. Maybe I was starting to catch on to this Fae racket. Watch duty, even when there is a real possibility of attack, can get boring. It's just not our nature to sit around and focus entirely on potentialities, at least not for too long at a time. My mind strayed a little and my thoughts remained in dangerous territory. This hostelry between realms, like crossroads, like the little hern house that had stood on the edge of the urban blight. Neither in nor out, just neutral. Until I arrived on the scene, and that crossroads turned into crosshairs. Now the Hearn family and the Goslings had suffered greatly. all for befriending me. My new love, the first being for whom I'd held genuine feelings I'd had in years, was now in peril, possibly of her very life, all for being with me. I realized I was being self-centered. There may have been some purpose related to her or to someone else, but I wanted to wallow in pointless misery and guilt. From the paperback novels and old movies I've absorbed over the years, I expected that any trouble would come during my second watch, in the dark early witching hour. It came during my mental self-flagellations on first watch, while I was not exactly unalert, but maybe a little distracted. Okay, I wasn't paying attention. Made sense. It was the time when my companions would be sleeping deeply. I had, however, to set aside my admiration for the tactics of my enemies for the moment. The hanging was snatched away, and a dark, looming figure stood silhouetted against the cook fire. It was as large as the big bad wolf and clad in similar armor. I could not see the face, but the intent was clear, since it held a battle axe in its left hand. Now, I did not sit idle when the curtain parted so hastily. I reacted by rolling to one side, drawing my blades and assuming a fighting stance. The figure simply stood. It stared with blazing eyes that generated a sense of dread that led to anger. I unreasonably hated this creature who had dared disturb my mental pictures of her. Mac Tirmor and Girer had sprung from their pallets and risen with short weapons to account for the confined space. I did not spare them a glance, but kept my eyes on my opponent, and his gaze remained steadily upon my own. "Come fight, carrion eater," his voice grated. "You are less than a craven cur dog, a coward and of no consequence." Here was a game I understood. He wanted to goad me so that I'd make an unthinkable attack. His insults, well, a little old-fashioned, had raised my hackles. I already felt an unreasoning anger. Perhaps I had reasons to be angry, just not at him, yet. He changed tact. "You are weak and stupid. You will fail in your quest. Likely the girl has already found a more fitting mate. If not, perhaps I will seek her out and show her what a real man, a warrior rather than a mangy mutt, can do for her." That pushed my buttons as he'd intended. But before I could surge forward, my grandfather barked out one word. "Hand!" It caused me to pause and regain a modicum of control. Then I saw the figure's right hand. It was red and dipped with blood. My earlier failure to recall the geas rose in my consciousness, and another prohibition came to my mind that I'd learned in my first vacation in Otherworld for training. Never fight a man with a red right hand. I pushed my weapons back into their scabbards and fastened them in place. I hadn't expected to be tested again so soon, but I was determined to do better than I had the first time, with the geas. This rule about the red right hand applied to all. The figure glared at my grandfather. "I am not here for you, old wolf, but one day I or another will come and you will face your doom." The being swirled like Tom Tildrum, his dark cloak a shadow in the flickering light of the hearth fire, and was gone. Mac Tirmor eased out a breath. "That was too close, Rob. Make sure that you hold on to your temper. That being would have killed you, and there's nothing anyone could have done to protect you. No one wins against the Les Erg. The only escape is to avoid the fight. Once you engaged in battle with him, he will not stop until you are slain. So, You failed once and succeeded once tonight. I did not expect you to be tested again so soon." He exactly echoed my own thoughts. Others are aware of your restrictions, and those that apply to us all are common knowledge on this side. Sooner or later, they will find a way to trick you into breaking your geisha, or more general rule. At best, breaking the geisha will invite a further attack. This one was clever. It used your breaking of one prohibition to entice you towards breaking another. At worst, a geisha may bring harm in its own right. You are nearing adulthood and you must be careful. You are good at the rules of Mundania. Now you must master those of your home world. Girer took the watch and I settled down to try and rest and calm my nerves. Before my eyes closed, I looked through the hastily and poorly replaced hangings across the cubby where Siobhan and Kortka had been ensconced. The curtain was open and they were gone from the hostel. Early the next morning, we rose and Girer left to fetch the livestock. I still couldn't believe that I could ride a horse. Different than riding a bike, but kind of fun, like a living bike. I wondered if I could one day take my mount back and glamour him to look like a bike. I had to shake off the silly thought. I felt a moment's guilt for forgetting the seriousness of our quest. Now I'd gone and done it. First, it was wistful. Now it was a quest. I was in danger of becoming a nerd. Pretty soon I'd be looking at Grandpa Wolf as the dungeon master. We proceeded as the sun rose and cast her red eye across the landscape. I don't know what I'd expect when we'd entered the dark realm. Maybe shadows or clouds. Yet the change was more in feeling than in appearance. Though the flora soon took on a more tropical appearance, and the temperature warmed considerably as we passed beyond the border. My mood shifted to dark and sought the very shadows I'd expected to visibly perceive. I sensed a heaviness, like a burden of spirit. Mac Timor assumed that grim look that he projected so effectively. Girer, never a particularly cheerful fellow, looked downright mournful. I thought tears would well at any moment. Even the horses seemed listless and plodded rather than trotted. The border was only sparsely settled, since the area would be susceptible to raids. Yet they might also be more easily raid the lands beyond, so the area held some residents. The Steedings and Rats, as MacTiermore named them, looked strong and forbidding. There were fields with folk working in them. Most looked human enough, but one could never be sure. Some were definitely beings of some other sort. All in all, it was a bucolic version of the mean streets. I simply needed to learn new street rules and get to know the major players, I assured myself. Easier to see things coming without so many buildings, I assured myself. As grim in mind as Grandpa was of face. I began to grow weary of this grimmality and broke the silence. Lord Wolf, what sort of place are we seeking? And what will we have to overcome to rescue Sorsha? My grandfather decided that it was an inquiry worthy of a response. We are headed to the Dun, the castle for this realm. All roads will lead to it, so we don't have to seek, only follow. As for what we will face, we will know when we face it. There will be some head-on challenges and some subtle ones. There are always both kinds among the Fae. We worry about specifics when they come to us. We don't do much planning in Otherworld. No point when every plan crumbles under the law of the Murphy. I had to smile at that. Even here, the rules of snafu and foobar were the most basic and powerful. So quoth this raven. Oh, the horse is a bicycle. That reminds me of Celty Sturluson. If anybody knows who that is, mention it in the comments and I will be ever so impressed. This is getting really good. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am, darlings. Have a thoroughly wonderful Thursday. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.